All right, so moving on in our discussion, in the discussion here of the cultural matrix of inquiry, we come to language. So language is going to be an important, very important topic in this book. So kind of the second main point here of this chapter, language occupies a peculiarly significant place and exercises a peculiarly significant function in the complex that forms the cultural environment. Language, is itself a cultural institution. So something formed in culture, something made within culture. So it's a cultural institution, and from one point of view, is but one among many such institutions. There's a variety of cultural institutions, of ways of interacting, of ways of getting stuff done, of forms of relationship, families, marriages. We could talk about businesses when we get into modern times. Maybe in earlier times you might talk about forms of hunting or kinship systems and all of these sort of things. Agriculture. So cultural institutions, money would be another important one. But yeah, language is a cultural institution alongside other cultural institutions. But it is, one, the agency by which other institutions and acquired habits are transmitted, and two, it permeates both the forms and the contents of all other cultural activities. So in one sense, language is just one of many cultural institutions, but it's also, in another way, the foundation of other cultural institutions, because it's the way that those get set up and transmitted over time. And it's how those institutions get done. That's how we perform the rituals of things like forming a marriage or forming a new business and so on and so forth, and forming our laws, for example. All that happens through language. Moreover, 3, it has its own distinctive structure, which is capable of abstraction as a form. So language also has a form. Not only is it important for determining the form of other institutions, it has its own form. We can abstract from it to get a form. For example, in grammar, we might talk about subject, verb, object form, which can be different in different languages, but in any case, that's one maybe example of what he's talking about. This structure, or the subject-predicate form, which I believe we've already discussed a little bit, and will come in again at some point. But in any case, this structure, when abstracted as a form, had a decisive influence historically upon the formation of logical theory, so the connection between culture and logic. The symbols, which are appropriate to the form of language as an agency of inquiry, as distinct from its original function as a medium of communication, are still peculiarly relevant to logical theory. So linguistic symbols, right, are important to how logic gets done. These symbols originally aided communication, or enabled, allowed, afforded communication, which we'll say more about presently. So the symbols appropriate to the form of language as an agency of inquiry. So, of course, linguistic symbols also used in the control of inquiry. Consequently, further discussion will take the wider cultural environment for granted and confine itself to the especial function of language in affecting the transformation of the biological into the intellectual and the potentially logical. So there's many aspects of culture one might appeal to, but for focusing on logic, we can, just as a pragmatic matter, kind of background the rest of these cultural concerns and focus on language, which is kind of the main medium through which the other institutions are instituted and transmitted, and also are the gives us the materials for doing logic. So language is going to be important. Going on. In this further discussion, language is taken in its widest sense, a sense wider than oral and written speech. So we're not just talking about speech or written language. It includes the latter, but it also includes also not only gestures, but rites, ceremonies, monuments, and the products of industrial and fine arts. This might seem a very too wide of a sense for language, but we'll see why that is. A tool or machine, for example, is not simply a simple or complex physical object having its own physical properties and effects, but is also a mode of language. So tools, we can think of tools as modes of language. Why? Well, he's going to tell us. So a tool says something to those who understand it about operations of use and their consequences. So I think what he's trying to do here is fit language into something broader, which is something like sign use in the semiotic sense, or maybe semiosis, which is treating things as Morse Peckham would say, instructions for behavior. So they tell us to do something. It's kind of an instruction to do something. So a tool is not just a physical object that affects the physical world around it, but semiotically, it's an instruction of use for those who have been properly culturally instructed. But for example, if you go to a foreign culture, they might have different kinds of tools, and they might not be instructions for you. It might just be a physical object that you don't know what it's for or how to use it. But for someone from that culture, it's like an instruction for use. This can be used in these ways. So it says something to those who understand it. To the members of a primitive community, a loom operated by steam or electricity says nothing, because it's unfamiliar. It's out of their culture, outside of their culture, beyond their culture. It is composed in a foreign language, and so with most of the mechanical devices of modern civilization. In the present cultural setting, these objects are so intimately bound up with interests, occupations, and purposes that they have an eloquent voice. Right? They're part of I think what Clifford Geertz called a web of symbols. So they're meaningful. They tell us what to do, how to do something, why we should be doing that thing. So interests, occupations, and purposes. They're part of a whole system of meanings, right? And let's go on. Just checking my notes. I had some things written I wanted to bring up, but that's not quite yet. Okay. So next paragraph, the importance of language as the necessary and, in the end, sufficient condition of the existence and transmission of non-purely organic activities and their consequences lies in the fact that, on one side, it is a strictly biological mode of behavior, emerging in natural continuity from earlier organic activities, while, on the other hand, it compels one individual to take the standpoint of other individuals and to see and inquire from a standpoint that is not strictly personal but is common to them as participants or parties in a conjoint undertaking. Now, there's a long sentence, but a lot of important points in there. So language is a necessary and, in fact, sufficient condition for transmitting kind of, let's just say, non-instinctive activities, right? for the existence and transmission of non-purely organic activities and their consequences. So let's say, to kind of simplify things, instinctive or genetically determined activities. I don't know if this is strictly true, given what we know about animal behavior today. But again, I've discussed this in previous sections on this book. But it definitely provides for a very greatly extended range of non-purely organic behaviors, far beyond what other animals are capable of. And what else? So it's necessary and sufficient for the existence and transmission of these non-genetically determined behaviors. Let's just kind of keep that as maybe a simplistic way of putting it, but more or less true, more or less accurate. And it emerges, but language emerges in natural continuity from earlier organic activities, animal cries, gestures, things like that. I think Dewey is being purposely vague here because, of course, a lot of the research on how human behavior emerged from animal behavior was still in a tentative state and is still in kind of a tentative, changeable state. We're learning more and more, so I think he's being deliberately a little bit vague here. The point being that in this worldview, in this naturalistic worldview that we're trying to develop logic out of, language is seen as continuous, in a continuum with earlier forms of animal behavior, while on the other hand, it compels one individual to take the standpoint of other individuals. So through using language, we are forced to adopt a broader perspective. We touched on this in the previous section when he talks about logic resulting in general and objective statements. And language is part of how that happens. Language itself makes us adopt a wider perspective, a general perspective, right? Words are not just meaningful to me, they are communal property. To understand them, we have to take a communal orientation. And this was really developed also by George Herbert Mead. I don't think Mead is specifically mentioned here, although Dewey cites him in other places and in other writings. This was a very big theme in George Herbert Mead's writings, is adopting the perspective of the other. So it compels us to take the standpoint of others, see and inquire from a standpoint that is not strictly personal, that is not particular, that is not singular, but is common to them as participants or parties in a conjoint undertaking. So to come together, work together, act together, we need common meanings that are not particular, singular, personal. It may be directed by and toward, so linguistic utterances may be directed by and towards some physical existence, but it first has reference to some other person or persons with whom it institutes communication, the making of something common. Hence, to that extent, its reference becomes general and objective. So language is communicative, either with other actual biological individuals or with ourselves at later times in a kind of ongoing process, but it's communication. And let's point out here that communication, this has the same roots with words like communal, community, communism, right? So something about togetherness, something about the group, right? So communication, thinking of language as communication, of course, forces us to see it, forces us to look at things not from the individual perspective, but from the perspective of the group, of the people acting, trying to act together in a conjoint undertaking. You have that prefix again, con. Sometimes it appears as sometimes con or com, but same root according to my my etymological research, which I may or may not be remembering correctly, but I believe that's correct. See that with consciousness, as Dewey points out. I don't know if it's in this book, but it's in other places, and other philosophers have pointed this out too. The con in consciousness is knowing together. Shus, knowing, con, together, knowing together. Any case, that's a little bit of a digression. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Language is made up of physical existences, sounds or marks on paper, or a temple, statue, or loom. Right? So language has a physical part made up of physical things, the marks that represent letters and words, the artifacts that we make that are instructions to act in a certain way, in the same way that words are instructions to act in a certain way. But these physical existences do not operate or function as mere physical things when they are media of communication. So they're not just brute physical objects, right? We use them to do something else beyond their brute physical existence. So these physical existences operate in virtue of their representative capacity or meaning. And of course, meaning is going to be an important concept in Dewey's thought. And I believe we'll get some idea. I don't want to, say too much about it now. If he doesn't, I'm trying to remember. But because it's a little bit complex and maybe different from how people usually think about meaning, but it does make sense once you understand it. But I would like to let him explain it first. So anyway, physical existences of a language operate in virtue of their representative capacity or meaning. The particular physical existence which has meaning is, in the case of speech, a conventional matter. So this is going to be a tricky point. But the physical existence is conventional in the sense that different physical existences could have the same meaning. So the meaning is not tied to that specific physical existence. But is that where I am? Yeah, a conventional matter. But the convention or common consent which sets it apart as a means of recording and communicating meaning is that of agreement in action. So through our actions we come to agreements about the meanings of things. So that of agreement in action, of shared modes of responsive behavior and participation in their consequences. So through acting and undergoing the consequences of acting together, things take on meanings. The physical sound or mark gets its meaning in and by conjoint community of functional use, not by any explicit convening in a convention or by passing resolutions that a certain sound or mark shall have a specified meaning. Right? So the dictionary doesn't come first is another way of putting this. Dictionaries are kind of people coming together to agree on the explicit meanings of words, or the meanings of words put in terms of other words. And then in the process of making a dictionary, you do have a convention in the sense of a group of people coming together to agree on something. But that's a later development, right? Language exists first, then we write dictionaries, not the other way around. So he's pointing out that there is an agreement on meaning that arises through acting together and experiencing the consequences of acting together, whether that gets you to the consequence you hoped for or not. And you figure out whether you have been communicating properly or miscommunicating or whatever. Yeah, here we go. So even when the meaning of certain legal words is determined by a court, another form of maybe convention and determining meaning through actual literal convention, in determining meaning in the court system, it is not the agreement of the judges which is finally decisive, for such assent does not finish the matter. Right? So it's not over once the dictionary is made. It's not over once the judges come to agreement on what this sentence in the law means. Such assent does not finish the matter. It occurs for the sake of determining future agreements and associated behavior. So the reason why we do this is to try to give some better guide to future behavior. And it is this subsequent behavior which finally settles the actual meaning of the words in question. So it's the actual use of words to guide behavior, to coordinate behavior, that settles the meaning of them. Agreement in the proposition arrived at is significant only through this function in prompting agreement in action. So a very action-oriented approach to meaning, behavior-oriented approach to meaning. The pragmatist Harold Lee, philosopher, I think the generation after, probably like 2 generations after Dewey maybe, pointed this out as the main contribution of pragmatism was this behavioral theory of meaning, the pragmatist theory of meaning. This was pragmatism. Harold Lee saw this as pragmatism's central project, more so than, say, the theory of truth or knowledge or other things that pragmatism has been associated with. Kind of the key thing here is meaning. How does the world become meaningful? And for the pragmatist, it becomes meaningful through conjoint action. So let's go on, I think, to the last paragraph for this video. The reason for mentioning these considerations is that they prove that the meaning which is a conventional symbol that the meaning which a conventional symbol has is not itself conventional. I want to draw your attention to this important sentence and I think kind of difficult to understand idea. So I think many people recognize that language is conventional in some way, that the words we use, there's nothing kind of in nature that determines what they mean, or that determines why we use DOG to mean to help us kind of refer to, talk about, act with respect to a certain type of animal, rather than ROG, let's say. Why we use dog or raw rather than rog is a little bit is conventional or arbitrary, or there's historical reasons for it, but there's no kind of natural reasons for it. But he's saying that although symbols are conventional, right? We've just heard that the symbols that we use are conventional, but the meaning is not itself conventional. And this can be hard to understand. But I think, again, he's pointing to this idea of conjoint action and the consequences of actions. These are not conventional. So yes, saying dog rather than rog or bog or whatever to help us talk about a certain kind of animal is conventional, but the actual fact that it gets used with respect to a certain kind of animal that coordinates behavior with respect to a certain kind of animal is not itself conventional. These are kind of real world things. I'll maybe return to this. Let's get through the rest of this paragraph. I don't want to dwell too much on this now, but I want to point out that that is an important and subtle point. So the meaning of conventional symbols is not itself conventional. For the meaning is established by agreements of different persons in existential activities, having reference to existential consequences. Right? Agreements of different persons in existential, real-world, practical activities, having reference to existential consequences, to things that really will happen, not conventionally, but actually happen to us if we get communication right or wrong. The particular existential sound or mark that stands for dog or justice in different cultures is arbitrary or conventional in the sense that although it has causes, there are no reasons for it. This is kind of what I was saying. There's kind of historical reasons for it, why different languages are the way they are, but there's no kind of natural, rooted in nature reason for it. So he's using the words a little bit differently than I was using them. So there's, maybe you could say, historical causes that lead us to say dog rather than something else. But there's nothing, there's no kind of fundamental reason for that, right? It could be replaced by a totally other word and life would go on fine as long as everyone, as long as everyone accepted that particular word for what it is. Let's see, where are we? So no reasons for it. But insofar as it is a medium of communication, its meaning is common, right? Communication, common. Related words. Because it is constituted by existential conditions. So the meaning of the word is constituted by existential conditions, which is to say conjoint actions, coordinated or miscoordinated actions. If a word varies in meaning in intercommunication between different cultural groups, then to that degree communication is blocked and misunderstanding results. Right? So sometimes a word can have you have the same word with different meanings in different cultures. And if that is not recognized explicitly, miscommunication, misunderstanding results. Communication is blocked. Indeed, there ceases to be communication until variations of understanding can be translated through the meaning of words into a meaning that is the same to both parties. So communication means that we have to have the same understanding of the signs or the symbols that we are using. Whenever communication is blocked and yet is supposed to exist, misunderstanding, not merely absence of understanding, is the result. It is an error to suppose that the misunderstanding is about the meaning of the word in isolation. So it's not just, the misunderstanding is not just about what this or that particular word means, what dog means or justice means in and of themselves. So that's not the source of misunderstanding. Just as it is fallacious to suppose that because two persons accept the same dictionary meaning of a word, they have therefore come to agreement and understanding. For agreement and disagreement are determined by the consequences of conjoint activities. Harmony or the opposite exists in the effects produced by the several activities that are occasioned by the words used. So just agreeing that we can use dog to refer to a four-legged animal, household animal, does not mean that we have come to any sort of real agreement or real understanding. That's only determined if we are able to act on that in a harmonious way, in a coordinated way. So just agreeing on the word kind of intellectually is not the main thing. This doesn't really mean very much. It's how that actually impacts action in the world, real existences, which shows whether understanding really has taken place. And that's a pretty good place to stop. So I will stop here and we'll continue on with the third main point in the next video.